Lord, I pray that in this moment, in the words that I offer, in what I speak, you ground me first in your presence, and you move your Spirit through these words in this moment, that we hear you, hear your message, feel the touch of your Spirit. Lord, may these words I offer be pleasing to you, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. There was a young woman who finally had the apartment of her dreams. From the time she was a teenager, she would talk about how she didn't want to have an apartment or a home that looked like people had just put it all together, hodgepodge from leftovers and hand-me-downs, and nothing fit together. No, her home was going to have a design to it. It was going to look like those homes you see in magazines. And she now had her apartment. She had moved to the cities, and she had an apartment that just thrilled her. When she would walk in the door, she could see it had beautiful, elegant, clean, sleek lines. Every piece was carefully chosen. It created this ambiance of sophistication and culture. And this particular afternoon, she came home on a Sunday to her apartment. And she opened up the window blinds so that she could look out as the lights were coming on in the other buildings in the city, and they would light up her windows with all these little twinkle lights. And it was beautiful. And she looked around her apartment, and she felt a sense of pride that she had created this space that was hers and hers alone, and it was everything that she imagined it was. And somehow, having the window open and seeing the lights come on in all the other buildings made her feel a little less. Well, she wasn't really lonely, but she was alone. And it made her feel a little less alone. It was time for her to make her meal. And it was Sunday, so of course, there was no question about what meal she was going to make. It's Sunday, so it's tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches, because that's what you have on a Sunday. It's what she'd always had. Now, this day was a little different. She could have just opened the can and dumped it in and got the American cheese and the white bread and made grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. But for some reason, this Sunday felt a little different. And she went to a little bit more effort. She started with fresh tomatoes and onions and garlic and roasted them in the oven and then put them through her food processor to puree them. And then she added fresh basil and some pesto, and she added a splash of red wine and then some heavy cream, and she made this beautiful bisque. And when she went to make her sandwich, she had some lovely artisan bread, and she used a mix of Swiss and sharp cheddar, and she toasted and grilled them to perfection, golden crispy edges, and then she cut them into 4 perfect triangles, because everybody knows triangles dip better than squares. And you have to dip your sandwich in your soup. It has to happen. She sets her table. She has a beautiful, bright gold orange placemat, and her dishes are red pottery, heavy, beautiful pieces. And she puts together her place setting with her bowl of bisque and her grilled cheese sandwich, and she looks at it, and the phone rings. And she gets that sinking feeling in her stomach because it's Sunday, and the phone always rings on Sunday, usually about this time. And she knows the ringtone. It's that song from Tangled that the mother figure sings. It means it's her mother on the phone. She hasn't talked to her mother in a very long time. The last time they spoke, they both said things that they shouldn't have. Things that maybe they didn't even really mean, but hurt. And they'd never come back from it. She hadn't spoken to her mother since. It seemed easier somehow to hang on to that hurt and that feeling of betrayal and that her mother didn't love her enough to accept her, or whatever it might have been. It felt easier to nurse that than to take the risk of reaching back out. She didn't want to have another conversation like that. So she just didn't talk. She picks up the phone and she swipes to dismiss the call and sends it to voicemail. And looks at her meal. Beautiful bowl of soup. Beautiful golden triangles of cheesy wonderfulness. And she feels alone. There's another couple, a young, attractive couple, young men. One's African American, one's white. They've just moved to the community, and they're looking for a new church home. And they've learned in their search, there are certain things that they really need to pay attention to. For example, you don't get to church too early. They did that once, sat down together, waited for the service to begin, and a woman came in and looked at them, sat down next to them, put her very large purse between them, kind of huffed around, made snuffy noises, and then finally leaned over and said, "You know you're sitting in Mabel's seat." They moved. They figured it out. If they come a little bit later, everybody will be sitting in their seats, and so they won't have to worry about accidentally sitting in someone else's seat, and they'll be able to sit down and not feel like they're stealing something from someone. So this particular Sunday, they tried out a new church. And they came in right as the opening hymn was happening. And sure enough, the back row, must have been a Methodist church, the back row was completely empty. So they sat there and they looked around. And it was a beautiful church. And the music spoke to them. Gifted musicians were sharing their gifts and graces, and it just stirred something within them. And they looked at each other and they thought, maybe this is it. Maybe we found our home. And the preacher was eloquent and passionate, and they were moved and inspired. And then it happened to be a communion Sunday, and they were excited that they were going to be able to share in the Lord's Supper in this new faith community, and maybe this would be home. Maybe the meal would be a meal they would share with their new church family. Now, in this church, the ushers would always dismiss people from the back towards the front, and they would come and stand next to the row and gesture for the people to come forward to receive the elements. Well, the usher came to their back row and looked and saw them holding hands and took a step forward to the next row and left them sitting there. The one man, he was pretty ticked off. And he wanted to get up and go get in line and get communion anyway, but his partner put his hand on his shoulder and said, "No, it's okay. We don't come to the table just because we're mad and want to make a point. It's okay." So they sat there, unwelcome, not able to take the meal. And so when the service got to the final hymn, they stood up and they slipped out the back, much as they had slipped in at the beginning. And they walked out the big doors and went down those big steps to the street, hungry for the meal that made them feel at home. There was another meal. It was a meal set in an upper room with people who had been together for some time and had traveled together and learned a lot about each other. And the meal was ready. There was roast lamb, and there was bitter herbs, and there was bread, and there was wine. And they were going to have this meal, celebrating who they were and how God had been in their lives. But there was some dissent in the group. They weren't all one happy family. There were those that felt things should be done a little differently, or maybe move a little faster, or somehow things weren't happening quite the way they envisioned it would. And there was some tension. And they come to the meal, and they sit down, and Christ names that. He says, one of you who is dipping your hand into the bowl right now, one of you will betray me. Now you can imagine the feeling around that table. It wasn't warm and friendly at that moment. People asking, is it me? Is it him? But the meal is there. And Christ, in the midst of this uncertainty and discord and distrust, takes the bread and breaks it, saying, this is my body. And then he gives it, and everyone there eats. Whether they felt guilty, whether they were pointing fingers, whether they were worried about themselves, whether they were questioning their own role in all this, they ate the meal. And then Christ again took the cup, and he says, this is the cup of the new covenant. And again, he offers it to everyone in that room, and every one of them, whether or not they felt worthy, whether or not they thought they understood exactly what Jesus was doing, they took and they drank. And when the events of that weekend were over, when they again gathered together and shared a meal, well, they remembered. They remembered what it was, despite differences, to come together and share bread and share a cup with Christ in their midst. They remembered. Now, that young couple that was leaving the church, as they were turning and walking down the street to where they had parked their car, they heard this voice, "Yoo-hoo!" And at first they ignored it because, they're new here. They don't know anybody. Who'd be yelling at them? But they hear it again, "Yoo-hoo! Boys, I can't walk that fast. You have to stop." Well, they stopped. And they turned around, and coming down the stairs was this tiny little dynamo of a woman. Bright white hair. She's got her cane, and she's coming after them. And they're a little anxious. She comes right up to them, and she looks up at them, and she says, "I am so sorry. I didn't get a chance to for the service, and I didn't get a chance to say anything to you afterwards, and I knew when I saw you there that you were the ones to help me keep my promise. So I want to invite you to Sunday dinner. I want you to come and have a meal with me in my home." Now, they're polite young men, and they very politely says, "Oh, no, it's fine, really. We've got stuff at home. We'll be fine. It's no big deal." This is a woman you don't say no to. She puts her hands on her hips and she says, "Are you telling me you're going to make me break my promise to God?" Well, now they could tell she knew she had them by the twinkle in her eyes. So, of course, they went, "Well, sure, we'd be happy to come to share a Sunday meal with you." And she smiles. She says, "You see, every Sunday, I always make extra because I made a promise that if I ever saw someone in church that looked like they didn't have a place to go to have a meal, that they didn't maybe have a place where they felt at home, where they didn't know people, that I would invite them, that I'd always have enough food that I could invite anyone to come home and share my Sunday meal." They walked the block and a half to her house, and she's chattering the whole time. She wants to know their names and how they came to be together and what brought them into their town and what are their jobs and what are their dreams and by the time they got to their house, she knew their whole family histories. And then they could feel their shoulders kind of start dropping down. They're starting to feel a little more relaxed. But then she opens the door, and her little house seemed packed to the gills with people, and they hesitate. They didn't really want to face more rejection on a Sunday. But she just takes their hands and pulls them in behind her, and she says, "Oh, don't worry, this is all family. They're neighbors and they're friends, but they're all family because it's Sunday, and we come to share this meal." And then she announces to everybody, "Okay, I have to go into the kitchen. There's just a few more little things I need to prepare, but you all just sit here and chat and relax and have some of my sweet tea." And sure enough, she disappears in the kitchen, and a few minutes later comes out this short little Asian boy named Jin. And he's got a tray of glasses filled with sweet tea, and he's making the rounds in the room offering sweet tea. And pretty much everybody takes them. And he comes to the new couple last, and he says, "You got to try Mama Evie's sweet tea. She makes the best sweet tea." Well, they look at each other, because one, he doesn't like sweet drinks. But it seemed rude not to take it, so they both take some. And they try it, and, well, it was sweet tea. But somehow it still tasted pretty good. And then Jin stays by there, and he says, "Now, Mama Evie told me, I have to make sure you know everybody. So that's my bapa over there. We live next door, and I help Mama Evie out. I shovel her walks, and I mow her lawn. And so she always invites us over for a Sunday meal because, well, she's a better cook than my baba. So my baba and me, and then he looks really nervous in the corner where there's a very tall, austere woman with a tweed jacket and her hair up in a bun, and she's engaged in a conversation with a man that has one of those faces that just makes you smile because he always looks happy, and he's got a nice little round belly, and they're talking, but the man for some reason doesn't look quite as happy. And Jin goes on, he goes, "See her? That's Miss Maddie. She teaches English at the college. If she heard me say me instead of I'd be in a lot of trouble. You won't tell, will you?" Now, next to Miss Maddie, that's Joe. He takes care of Mama Evie's car. His wife just passed away a short time ago, and so Mama Evie has him come over here every single Sunday because he needs to have a meal with family. And as Jin is talking, the couple is looking at Miss Maddie and Joe, and they see Joe pull out a big handkerchief from his pocket and dab at his eyes. And this woman, who stands so very straight and tall, wraps her arms around him and gives him a hug. Now, right about then, Mama Evie pops her head back out of the kitchen, and she says, "Okay, things are almost ready, but my biscuits, they just came out of the oven, and everybody knows they're best when they're hot. So you all go ahead, you take a biscuit, you just get yourself comfortable, and in just a minute, I'll call you to dinner." Jin disappears and comes back out with a plate filled with steaming hot biscuits. And he walks around, and everybody takes one, and you can hear the sounds they're making. It's like, oh, that's good. Oh, she makes the best biscuits. And he comes to the couple, and they each take this lovely, hot, flaky biscuit, and they take a bite. And there's conversation that flows around them, laughter and sniffles and sighs. And they find themselves looking at the biscuit they're holding and the glass of sweet tea, and they're thinking, this is the meal. This is the meal I went to church for. This is the meal. It tastes like home. It tastes like love. Now that young woman sitting in her beautiful apartment with her grilled cheese sandwich and her tomato bisque is about to eat, but she sees the little blue light on her phone that says there's a voicemail. Now, she hasn't listened to the voice messages from her mother for a long time, but for some reason, she grabs her phone and listens to the message. "Sweetie," says her mom, "I just wanted to call. I miss you. I miss hearing your voice. I miss hearing what's going on. And I know that we said some hurtful things, but you need to know no matter what, I still love you. You're still my little girl." She stops. She listens to the message again. And then she listens to it again. And then before she can talk herself out of it, she calls her mom back. She's got a plan, you see. She can say, "Hey, Mom, we can't talk long because I've got dinner ready and I don't want it to get cold." but she feels like she should call. She does, and her mom answers the phone saying, "Sweetie, you called. It is so good to hear your voice." And the daughter finds herself saying, "Yeah, well, Mom, I can't talk long. I've got food on the table. I just wanted to call and say I got your message, and thanks for calling." And then they had one of those weird, awkward silences where nobody knows quite what to say because they don't want to say the wrong thing because they did last time. They want to find a way to navigate through this and not come out worse. And her mother breaks the silence. She says, "Well, I just finished making dinner too. What are you having for dinner?" And the daughter laughs. She goes, "Well, Mom, it's Sunday. I'm having tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches." And the mother laughs and she says, "So am I." And the daughter says, "Well, of course you are. Who do you think taught this to me?" And then the mother says, "Do you think it would be okay if we maybe turned the video on our phone and we could maybe chat while we eat?" And she hesitates. But then she agrees. She shows her mom her place setting with her tomato bisque and her beautiful grilled cheese sandwich. And her mother laughs and she says, "You cut it in triangles." And then she shows her setting. She can see the familiar kitchen with the yellow walls. And there's those dishes that have the big red rooster right in the middle of them. And her sandwich is cut in triangles too, because that's the best for dipping. They talk and they laugh and they eat. And somehow, in sharing the bread and the bowl, in the dipping and the eating, they connect. And that meal, it tastes like home. It tastes like love. It's communion. In the meal that Christ shared, Christ invited all of us in the bread and in the cup and in each other to feel his presence, to be strengthened, to be unified, to share a holy meal. We're all invited to a place at that table and to share that meal. And all the people say, Amen.